but are only passable in the dry season. The soil is fertile, and since there is a superabundance of sun and water, almost any crop or plant can be grown. The French officers, with the adaptive thrift of their nation, had already, in spite of the ravages of the water rats, created a good vegetable garden, from which they were able to supplement their monotonous fare. The natives, however, aboriginal negroes of the Dinka and Shilluk tribes, are unwilling to work, except to provide themselves with the necessaries of life, and since these are easily obtained, there is very little cultivation, and the fertility of the soil may be said to increase the poverty of the country. At all seasons of the year the climate of Fashoda is pestilential, and the malarial fever attacks every European or Egyptian, breaking down the strongest constitutions, and in many cases causing death. The place is most unhealthy, and in March 1899, the driest season of the year, out of a garrison of 317 men only 37 were fit for duty. From Sir William Garstin's report, Egypt, No. 5, 1899. On this dismal island, far from civilization, health, or comfort, the Marchand mission and the Egyptian garrison lived in polite antagonism for nearly 3 months. The French fort stood at the northern end. The Egyptian camp lay outside the ruins of the town. Civilities were constantly exchanged between the forces, and the British officers repaid the welcome gifts of fresh vegetables by newspapers and other conveniences. The Senegalese riflemen were smart and well-conducted soldiers, and the blacks of the Sudanese battalion soon imitated their officers in reciprocating courtesies. A feeling of mutual respect sprang up between Colonel Jackson and Major Marchand. The dashing commandant of the 11th Soudanese, whose Egyptian medals bear no fewer than 14 clasps, was filled with a generous admiration for the French explorer. Realizing the difficulties, he appreciated the magnificence of the achievement, and as he spoke excellent French, a good and almost cordial understanding was established, and no serious disagreement occurred. But, notwithstanding the polite relations, the greatest vigilance was exercised by both sides, and whatever civilities were exchanged were of a formal nature. The Dinkas and Shilluks had on the first arrival of the French made submission, and had supplied them with provisions. They knew that white men were said to be coming, and they did not realize that there were different races among the whites. Marchand was regarded as the advance guard of the Sirdar's army. But when the negroes gradually perceived that these bands of white men were at enmity with each other, were in fact of rival tribes, they immediately transferred their allegiance to the stronger force, and although their dread of the Egyptian flag was at first very marked, boycotted the French entirely. In the middle of October dispatches from France arrived for Marchand by steamer, and that officer, after reading them, determined to proceed to Cairo. Jackson, who was most anxious that no disagreement should arise, begged him to give positive orders to his subordinate to maintain the status quo, as had been agreed. Marchand gladly consented, and departed for Omdurman, where he visited the battlefield, and found in the heaps of slain a grim witness of the destruction from which he had been saved, and so on to Cairo, where he was moved to tears and speeches. But in his absence Captain Germain, who succeeded to the command, diverged from his orders. No sooner had Marchand left than Germain, anxious to win distinction, embarked upon a most aggressive policy. He occupied the Dinka country on the right bank of the river, pushed reconnoitring parties into the interior, prevented the Dinka sheikhs from coming to make their submission at Fashoda, and sent his boats and the Faidherbe steam launch, which had returned from the south, beyond the northern limits which the Sirdar had prescribed and Marchand had agreed to recognize. Colonel Jackson protested again and again. Germain sent haughty replies and persisted in his provoking policy. At last the British officer was compelled to declare that if any more patrols were sent into the Dinka country, he would not allow them to return to the French post. Whereat Germain rejoined that he would meet force with force. All tempers were worn by fever, heat, discomfort, and monotony. The situation became very difficult, and the tact and patience of Colonel Jackson alone averted a conflict which would have resounded in all parts of the world. He confined his troops strictly to their lines, and moved as far from the French camp as was possible. But there was one dark day when the French officers worked in their shirts with their faithful Senegalese to strengthen the entrenchments, and busily prepared for a desperate struggle. On the other side little activity was noticeable. The Egyptian garrison, although under arms, kept out of sight, but a wisp of steam above the funnels of the redoubtable gunboats showed that all was ready. At length, in a fortunate hour, Marchand returned, reproved his subordinate, and expressed his regrets to Colonel Jackson. Then it became known that the French government had ordered the evacuation of Fashoda. Some weeks were spent in making preparations for the journey, but at length the day of departure arrived. At 8:20 on the morning of the 11th of December the French lowered their flag with salute and flourish of bugle. The British officers, who remained in their own camp and did not obtrude themselves, were distant but interested spectators. On the flag ceasing to fly, a sous-officier rushed up to the flagstaff and hurled it to the ground, shaking his fists and tearing his hair in a bitterness and vexation from which it is impossible to withhold sympathy, in view of what these men had suffered uselessly and what they had done. The French then embarked, and at 9:30 steamed southward, the Faidherbe towing one oblong steel barge and one old steel boat, the other 3 boats sailing, all full of men. As the little flotilla passed the Egyptian camp, a guard of honour of the 11th Soudanese saluted them, and the band struck up their national anthem. The French acknowledged the compliment by dipping their flag, and in return the British and Egyptian flags were also lowered. The boats then continued their journey until they had rounded the bend of the river, when they came to land, and honour being duly satisfied, Marchand and his officers returned to breakfast with Colonel Jackson. The meeting was very friendly. Jackson and Germain exchanged most elaborate compliments, and the commandant, in the name of the 11th Soudanese, presented the expedition with the banner of the Emir who had attacked them, which had been captured at Reng. Marchand shook hands all around, and the British officers bade their gallant opponents a final farewell. Once again the 8 Frenchmen, who had come so far and accomplished so much, set out upon their travels, to make a safe though tedious journey through Abyssinia to the coast, and thence home to the country they had served faithfully and well, and which was not unmindful of their services. Let us settle the international aspect of the reconquest of the Sudan while we are in the way with it. The disputes between France and England about the valley of the Upper Nile were terminated, as far as material cause was concerned, by an agreement, signed in London on the 21st of March, 1899, by Lord Salisbury and Monsieur Cambon. The declaration limiting the respective spheres of influence of the two powers took the form of an addition to the 4th article of the Niger Convention, concluded in the previous year. Its practical effect is to reserve the whole drainage system of the Nile to England and Egypt, and to engage that France shall have a free hand, so far as those powers are concerned, in the rest of northern Africa west of the Nile Valley not yet occupied by Europeans. This stupendous partition of half a continent by 2 European powers could scarcely be expected to excite the enthusiasm of the rest. Germany was, however, soothed by the promise of the observance of the open door policy upon the Upper Nile. Italy, protesting meekly, followed Germany. Russia had no interests in this quarter. France and England were agreed. The rest were not consulted, and the declaration may thus be said to have been recognised by the world in general. It is perhaps early to attempt to pronounce with which of the contracting powers the advantage lies. France has acquired at a single stroke, without any serious military operations, the recognition of rights which may enable her ultimately to annex a vast African territory. At present what she has gained may be described as a recognised sphere of aspiration. The future may convert this into a sphere of influence, and the distant future may witness the entire subjugation of the whole region. There are many difficulties to